I was grading papers once on a section about political survival. One student wrote something that made me stop and think. He said, political power isn't about how many people support you. It's about whether those people can still vote for you next election. Simple observation, but profound, because what happens when your voters start disappearing? What happens when the community that put you in office starts shrinking? What happens when the base that elected you can't elect you anymore? That student was asking the right question, and this week, Ilhan Omar is about to find out the answer. Let me tell you what I'm watching develop in Minnesota. The Trump administration is sending federal immigration agents to Minneapolis, about 100 of them, and they're focusing on the Somali community, the same community that forms Omar's political base, the same people who put her in Congress. Now, I'm not going to tell you this is good or bad. I'm going to tell you what it means, because the pattern here is older than America, and if you understand the pattern, you understand what's coming next. When I farmed, I learned something about soil and roots. You can have the healthiest plant in the world, strong stem, green leaves, looks great above ground, but if something starts eating the roots underground, that plant is going to die. Doesn't matter how good it looks today. You won't see it happening at first. The plant looks fine, but underneath, the foundation is being destroyed. And one day, not too far in the future, that plant falls over, and everyone acts surprised. But it was predictable. The roots were gone. I remember one season I had a beautiful stand of corn, looked perfect from the road, tall, green. People would drive by and compliment me on it, but I knew something they didn't. Wireworms had gotten into the roots early in the season. Underground, those roots were being eaten away. The corn kept growing for a while, using up whatever root system was left. But about 3 weeks before harvest, a moderate wind came through. Not even a strong wind, just normal summer wind, and half that field fell over. Everyone was shocked. Beautiful corn just collapsed. But it wasn't the wind's fault. The wind just revealed what was already true. The foundation was gone. Politics works exactly the same way. Omar's political power comes from one place. The Somali community in Minneapolis, they vote as a bloc. They turn out. They support her. That's her foundation. That's her roots. But what happens when immigration enforcement starts affecting that community? What happens when some of those voters aren't voters anymore? What happens when the foundation starts shrinking? The plant falls over. Every single time. Let me give you some historical context, because this exact pattern has played out before. In ancient Rome, there was a political faction that based its entire power on the urban poor. They promised free grain, free entertainment, protection from the wealthy, and the urban poor would vote for them consistently. These were called populares. Popular politicians. They'd stand in the forum and give speeches about how they represented the common people against the aristocracy. They'd promise redistribution. They'd promise protection. They'd promise that the wealthy would never be able to push the poor around. Worked great for a while, but then something happened. Rome started having grain shortages. Egypt, which supplied most of Rome's grain, had bad harvests. The free grain couldn't be delivered anymore. The distribution stopped, the promises couldn't be kept, and the urban poor started leaving the city to find food elsewhere. Some went to the countryside, some joined the army, some left Italy entirely. The population that supported these politicians began shrinking. And you know what happened to those politicians? They lost power fast because their entire base was gone. They had built their careers on representing one specific group. And when that group shrank, they had nowhere else to go. They couldn't pivot to representing the wealthy. The wealthy already had their own representatives. They couldn't pivot to representing the middle class. The middle class didn't trust them. They couldn't pivot to representing anyone else because everyone knew these politicians had spent their entire careers defining themselves against everyone except the urban poor. So they just disappeared from politics. Some tried to maintain relevance by making increasingly extreme promises. Some tried to blame the aristocracy for the grain shortage. Some tried to claim foreign enemies were sabotaging Rome's food supply. None of it worked, because their base was gone. And without a base, a politician is nothing. Same pattern, different century, same result. Now let's talk about what's actually happening in Minnesota. The Trump administration is enforcing immigration law. You can have whatever opinion you want about that policy, but it's happening. And it's specifically focusing on communities where there are large numbers of people whose status is questionable. Minneapolis has the largest Somali population in America. Estimates say around 80,000 people. That's a significant community and a significant voting bloc. But here's the question nobody's asking out loud. How many of those 80,000 are citizens who can vote? How many are legal residents? How many are here on temporary status that might be revoked? How many are undocumented? I don't know the answer. Nobody does. But immigration enforcement is about to find out. And whatever that number is, Omar's political foundation is about to shrink by that amount. Think about what that means. If she won her last election by 20,000 votes and immigration enforcement affects even 5,000 potential voters in her district, that changes her political math completely. She's not safe anymore. She's vulnerable. And politicians who become vulnerable start making different decisions. They moderate, they pivot, they try to appeal to a broader base. But Omar can't do that because her entire political identity is built on being the representative of the Somali community. If she moderates, if she pivots, if she tries to appeal to a broader base, she loses the very people who put her in office. That's what I mean by a trap. She's politically trapped, no good options, no way out. Let me tell you about another historical example, because I want you to see this pattern clearly. In the Byzantine Empire, there was a political faction called the Blues. They represented circus performers, entertainers, and certain ethnic minorities in Constantinople. Had a lot of power for decades. They could influence elections. They could riot in the streets and force policy changes. Emperors had to negotiate with them. But then Emperor Justinian started enforcing residency laws more strictly, started requiring documentation, started removing people who couldn't prove their legal status in the city. And the Blues' power base started shrinking. Not all at once, gradually, but steadily. At first, the Blues fought back. They organized protests. They rioted. There was even a massive uprising called the Nika riots where they nearly overthrew Justinian. They burned half of Constantinople. They proclaimed a new emperor. But Justinian brought in the army, put down the riots, killed thousands of people, and kept enforcing the residency laws. And within a generation, the Blues were politically irrelevant. They couldn't elect anyone. They couldn't influence policy. They couldn't protect their interests because the community they represented had been reduced to a fraction of its former size. The pattern is always the same. Build your power on one specific community. Make your career about protecting that community. Then watch what happens when that community gets smaller. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not celebrating this. I'm not condemning it. I'm analyzing it because understanding patterns is more important than having opinions about them. What I'm seeing is a collision between two different approaches to politics. Omar represents identity politics, the idea that you represent a specific ethnic or religious community. Your job is to protect that community's interests. Your loyalty is to that group. The Trump administration represents enforcement politics, the idea that laws exist and should be enforced. If you're here illegally, you face consequences. If you're not a citizen, you don't get to stay just because a politician wants to protect you. These two approaches are incompatible. They can't both win. One has to lose. And historically, enforcement wins every single time. Not because it's morally right, not because it's morally wrong, but because governments have more power than individual politicians. When a government decides to enforce its laws, politicians who built their careers on protecting people who break those laws lose. That's just how it works. When I taught political science, I used to ask students this question: what happens when a politician's promises meet reality? What happens when what they said they'd do becomes impossible to deliver? Most students would say the politician gets voted out, but that's not quite right. What actually happens is more interesting. The politician doubles down. They get louder, they get angrier, they blame the government, they blame the system, they blame racism or xenophobia or whatever. But they never admit that their approach was flawed from the beginning, and their supporters believe them for a while. But eventually, reality wins. The promises don't come true. The protection doesn't materialize. The community they were supposed to protect gets smaller, and the politician loses power. I'm watching that exact sequence play out right now. Omar has been telling her Somali constituents that she'll protect them, that she'll fight for them, that she'll use her position in Congress to shield them from immigration enforcement. But she can't, because she's one representative out of 435. She has no real power to stop federal immigration enforcement, none at all. And her constituents are about to learn that lesson, not from me, not from political commentators, but from experience. When immigration agents show up in their neighborhoods, Omar's promises won't stop them. Her speeches won't protect anyone. Her position in Congress won't matter at all. That's reality meeting rhetoric, and reality always wins. Let me tell you what happens next, because I've seen this pattern play out before. First, Omar is going to get louder. She's going to give speeches about injustice. She's going to call it racist. She's going to say Trump is targeting her community because they're Muslim or because they're black or because they're immigrants. And some people will believe that. Her core supporters will rally around her. There will be protests. There will be news coverage. There will be a lot of noise. But underneath all that noise, the enforcement will continue steadily, consistently, and her political base will keep shrinking. Second, other Democrats in Minnesota are going to start distancing themselves from her, quietly at first, then more openly. Because if you're a Democrat trying to win a statewide race in Minnesota, you don't want to be associated with someone who's become the face of opposing immigration enforcement. Minnesota isn't that liberal. There are a lot of voters in Minnesota who think immigration laws should be enforced. So Democrats who want to win statewide will start making it clear that Omar doesn't speak for them, that her views are her own, that they're not part of her coalition. That's already starting. You can see it if you look carefully. The Minnesota Democratic Party isn't defending her. The governor isn't standing with her. Other representatives aren't echoing her rhetoric. They're letting her stand alone because they know she's politically toxic. Third, and this is the most interesting part, Omar's going to have to make a choice. She can continue being the defender of illegal immigrants in her community. That keeps her current supporters happy, but it makes her irrelevant to everyone else. She becomes a one-issue politician representing a shrinking constituency. Or she can moderate. She can acknowledge that immigration law exists and should be enforced. She can try to broaden her appeal. She can attempt to represent all of her district, not just the Somali community. But if she does that, she loses the very people who elected her, because they didn't elect her to represent all of Minnesota. They elected her to represent them. Either choice ends the same way: loss of power, loss of influence, political irrelevance. That's what I mean by a trap. There's no way out. Now, let me tell you why this matters to you. Even if you don't live in Minnesota, even if you don't care about Ilhan Omar, even if you think this whole thing is just political theater, this pattern is playing out in cities across America. Anywhere there's a politician who built their career on identity politics. Anywhere there's someone whose power comes from representing one specific ethnic or religious community against the broader society, those politicians are all facing the same collision. Identity politics versus enforcement. Promises versus reality. Rhetoric versus power. And they're all going to lose for the same reason Omar is going to lose. Because you can't build sustainable political power by representing people who aren't supposed to be here. Eventually, the government enforces its laws. And when it does, your base disappears. That's not my opinion. That's just math. When I farmed, we had a saying, don't plant crops in fields you don't own. Because no matter how much work you put in, no matter how good the harvest looks, the owner can take that field away from you at any time. One of my neighbors learned this the hard way. He was renting land from someone who said he'd never sell. My neighbor put in irrigation, built fences, improved the soil, spent years making that land productive. Then the owner died, the kids inherited the land, and they sold it to a developer. My neighbor got 30 days notice. All that work, all that investment, gone. He was bitter about it for years, kept saying it wasn't fair, kept saying he had a moral right to that land because of all the work he'd put in. But that didn't matter. He didn't own it. And when the real owner decided to take it back, all his arguments about fairness meant nothing. Omar planted her entire political career in a field she doesn't own. She built her power on people whose status in this country was always temporary, always conditional, always dependent on the government choosing not to enforce certain laws. And now the government is enforcing those laws, and her field is being taken away. Let me give you another historical example. This one's more recent. You can learn from it. In the 1,980 seconds and 90 seconds, there were politicians in California who built their careers on representing illegal immigrants from Mexico. They promised protection. They promised services. They promised that immigration status wouldn't matter. And it worked. They got elected. They had power. They had influence. But then in the mid-90 seconds, California voters passed Proposition 187. It cut off most public services to illegal immigrants. It required verification of immigration status. It said schools couldn't enroll students who couldn't prove legal residency. And you know what happened to those politicians, the ones who'd built their careers on representing illegal immigrants? They lost power. Some lost elections. Some became irrelevant. Some had to completely change their political identity because their base was affected by enforcement. Their promises couldn't be kept. Their protection couldn't materialize. I remember one state representative who'd spent 15 years representing a heavily Mexican district. His whole career was built on protecting illegal immigrants. When Proposition 187 passed, he tried to fight it, gave speeches, organized protests, promised his constituents he'd find a way around it. But he couldn't. And in the next election, he lost his seat. Not to a Republican, to another Democrat who'd been smart enough not to build his career on protecting people who weren't supposed to be here. Same pattern, same result. Now, Proposition 187 was later struck down by courts, but that's not the point. The point is that politicians who base their power on protecting people who break the law are always vulnerable, because governments can enforce laws whenever they choose. And when they do, those politicians lose. That's what's happening to Omar right now. Not might happen, is happening. The Trump administration is enforcing immigration law in her district. Her base is being affected. Her promises are being tested, and she can't deliver. Everything that happens after this is predictable. I could write the script right now. She'll get angry. She'll blame racism. She'll call it targeting. She'll say Trump is singling her out.